We do have the honor of having you, Ambassador Peter Shobaj-Hedji. Your extensive career in banking, consulting, venture capitalist, diplomacy, and social work. I'm very familiar with how you started out because I too am a New Yorker. And we actually ended up working in the same bank at different times, obviously. You, however, went to LSE, got your degree there, as well as University of Chicago, before you started working at Chemical Bank, now part of JP Morgan. And there, you ran the interest rate hedging of the entire bank's balance sheet. Very relevant for what we saw happening in the banking system last month in the United States. After your 30 years in the United States, you moved in 1991 to Hungary, where you ran the management consulting business for Deloitte & Touche, Hungary's operations, which included the Central and Eastern European area, where the ambassador was responsible for 27 out of the 30 banks that Deloitte was consulting and advising. You also spent a decade in venture capital, mostly within Eastern Europe and Central Europe, as I understand, after which you were asked to be ambassador to the UK for Hungary during a time that was quite interesting that we look forward to hearing from you later. And I understand currently you're active in a lot of very social and charitable activities, including the Order of Malta. And we look forward to not only your contribution to the group discussions, but afterwards, if you could take a little bit of time to talk about Hungary and in the context of both Europe and globally. So I would appreciate that. So welcome, Ambassador. So now, if I could just click the slide, or if someone could click it for me. You should close your eyes for a moment and then look at the screen. And unfortunately, given the size of the screen, I couldn't fit the bottom of the Wall Street Journal article, but this is dated from October of 2014. And if you think in terms of where we started this entire move in terms of low interest rate era that has just ended, we obviously start with the great financial crisis, because prior to that, we were at much higher rates. The great financial crisis and the resulting recession, depression, however you describe it, brought down the rates immediately and, in the eyes of many, helped save the financial system. The question is, 6 years later, we have the situation where the world, or the central bankers, are still worrying about deflation. And so I ask one or two of you, first of all, to perhaps for the audience, define deflation. We had Nevin describe inflation, but I think the audience would appreciate the definition of deflation. And in the context of that, was the Federal Reserve and the ECB justified in worrying about deflation to such an extent in 2014 that they kept rates as low for the next 8 years to 2022? So that's sort of the first topic of discussion. So first, if I could have a school teacher definition of deflation. Martin?
Well, it's not a school teacher definition, but an economist one. Well, if we look back in time, deflation actually meant a decrease in money supply. Nowadays, it just means a decrease in prices. So they switched the reason for sinking prices with the symptom, with the sinking prices, essentially. Yeah, and I don't necessarily agree that deflation would be a bad thing. Just think about which sectors of the economy were the sectors with the with decreasing prices in the last few years. And this was actually in the computer sector, in the IT sector. And these were also the sectors that had the most economic growth. These were the most productive sectors. And this essentially also, we can take also a look back in time. If you look to the US in the 18th and early 19th, no, even until mid-19th century, they had long periods of decreasing prices and still quite robust economic growth. So I wouldn't even say or agree with the central bankers that deflation is necessarily a bad phenomenon. The reason why central banks nowadays choose inflation is to make it easier for governments to rely on debt to finance what they took over from the private sector, so to speak. And that's why central banks try to enable these public spending with inflation. When it comes to whether the central bank was justified in increasing the money supply to fight inflation, no, I don't think so, for the reasons I just stated. I think they were not justified. This was something that enabled companies that are not productive anymore to survive in the economy, and this is one of the reasons why we will have many huge problems down the line. So,
well, who would you consider as the winners and losers in the kind of deflation that we're talking about here? Because there are clearly winners, consumers. What was the fears that were driving the central banks?
Martin, you're precisely right. Government benefits in this sort of era of, for lack of a better expression, the entrepreneurial government official from making use of this capital that's artificially been given to them and ultimately taking it away from the regular market. They create a market perversion that is going to be very, very difficult for us to undo. And I believe that the pressure here that you're talking about, John, is really designed to protect them from that day of reckoning.
And you're referring to the fiscal side?
Yes.
What about on the monetary side? Because there had been criticism at the time, because I remember that well, that if you take away the ability of the Fed, basically one could argue the Fed had no more cutting that it could do. So it was either out of a job and it just would have to sit there on the sidelines, which would have been great in my opinion, but they came up with these new tools, quantitative easing, the ECB, negative interest rates. Again, and let's address negative interest rates, because that's something the United States did not wish to do, but the Europeans did. Why was there that dichotomy? Why shouldn't we have done negative rates in the US if indeed, or why shouldn't the Europeans not have done it? Let's start with the US.
Well, you're talking about this problem of governments fearing allowing any pain into the equation, any discomfort. And so you look at the necessary expansion of prices because of availability of capital, which is that promise of Franklin Roosevelt, is notoriously famous for having said a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. That's been a promise of American politicians since the beginning of time, I believe. And the way to fuel that is through this fiction of encouraging people to believe that everyone can have everything. And perhaps that's correct on some level, but it takes time for that to occur. If you allow for interest rates to flow naturally, you will necessarily restrict access for some individuals to gain these objects. For example, as we've seen interest rates go up, credit debt in the United States has skyrocketed. People continue to spend in spite of the fact that they're not able to access either savings, which have already been spent through in a post-COVID period, or they're not able to use traditional bank debt against their own properties in order to access this dream of more stuff. so they've leaned on credit. It's a cycle that's played out over and over again throughout history, but certainly in the modern period since the 1940s.
John, I'd only add that you have to recall that the Fed and its regulators are still politically sensitive to 2008, 2009. And when they were dealing with inflation, the Silicon Valley Bank collapse happens. Now that 2009 memory comes back quite vividly. But you combine that with the fact that the average American citizen does not have any concept of monetary policy. They can't even explain what the Federal Reserve is. Their sense is, oh, well, they made more money. Making more money is good. And I was given that money for 2 years during COVID processes. So there's a political disassociation with the economic education of the average citizen that I think compounds all of this, that they don't understand how the system works. And so they just see their interest rates going up. They see prices going up, but they have no correlation to what had just happened in the previous 14 to 18 months when it came to bailouts and other things and that relationship.
I mean, we did go through a cultural shift in the US from the 60s, where you had the layaway plans and people would save to purchase their automobile or refrigerator. And we moved in the 80s into a buy now and pay later mode. Is that the reason why interest rates became much more sensitive to the public? Because if you think about it, back when we started work, the Federal Reserve was looking at money supply as their driver, not interest rates. And then we shifted to an interest rate focus as opposed to a money supply focus. What accounted for that change? And is that something we could go back to?
I think it goes back to what we were talking about a few seconds ago, which is the political world has begun to promise objects to people as a way to prove their worth. Rather than providing basic security, the fundamental tenets of government that were imagined really from certainly the beginning of the American experiment, but also around the world, and they've moved into this other goods and services sort of game, which is elect me and I will provide for you an Xbox and a trash compactor, whatever it is that somebody wants. And the way to fuel that is through this very odd extension of credit. So you think about secondary school education debt. I mean, there's a panoply of expenses that have been burdened upon the American population and really the global population that I'm not sure that people really needed or wanted. But they found their way to do that because it was a way to sell to a voter that if you vote for me, I'll provide more for you. It's interesting, this notion of the promises that are made by political leadership. It's not about security necessarily. It's about a better life, whatever that means. But interestingly enough, there isn't a corresponding improvement in happiness. There's nothing that suggests if you have 11 pairs of shoes that you're nominally happier than someone with 8. And yet that's the nature of the way that the political language has been framed, I would say, since the Depressionary period in the United States.
Something maybe to add to that. When you look at the data, when the interest rates began to rise again, the monetary supply, especially M2, was not sinking, which should actually happen if the interest rates rise. What does this imply? I don't want to go into too much detail now because that would be probably too long here, but it implies in essence that the prices for the private economy, the prices for money for the private economy were rising, but the prices for money for the government, for the public sector, was not rising. This was actually a hidden redistribution of wealth from the private sector to the public sector. That's what happened there.
Well, in a sense, aren't you all saying that price discovery disappeared because of artificially low rates?
Yeah, another to build on Terry, which I believe 13 tennis shoes is actually the appropriate number that everybody should have, but that's just my personal opinion. Between financial crisis and 2019, in particular, personal credit card debt in the United States dramatically increased continually and annually. It dropped significantly in 2020 and 2021. For the simple reason that people weren't spending as much, they were home, they all of a sudden had cash on hand, so savings actually began to go up dramatically as well. This is all a good thing. Some was contributed to paying off debt. Unfortunately, a lot of individuals received checks from the government and they did not necessarily pay down debt. They spent other things or did nefarious things. The moment there was this sense that I am no longer locked up at house, credit card debt has now begun to go up again. Now, part of that is inflationary pressure. Part of that is the fact of just costs and fear, et cetera. But to Terry's point, the memory is short. And we're right now back into, well, that credit card, I can do $5,000 more in credit, $10,000, $15,000. And we're back to the exact same pattern we had prior to the pandemic.
I'd like to, per the slide, ask John Chisholm, who comes from California and is familiar with Silicon Valley Bank, to sort of start off the banking crisis discussion.
Wow, that's quite a graphic. It was indeed shocking to see Silicon Valley Bank collapse. I've been in Silicon Valley for 40 years, and it is as much a fixture of an institution as there is. Two of the companies I founded used Silicon Valley Bank for all of our savings and funds. The management of Silicon Valley Bank absolutely made mistakes and did some foolish things, investing in long-term securities that were secured only by short-term deposits that depositors could take out at any time. The cavalier approach that Silicon Valley Bank's management used to raise $2 billion, or try to raise $2 billion too late, and that financing did not succeed. But much less talked about than the mistakes that Silicon Valley Bank made are the impact of the actions of the Fed on Silicon Valley Bank and other banks, and how the actions of the Fed precipitated, in my view, SVB's failure. So interest rates were held artificially low for way too long. And so when inflation started to rear its ugly head, the Fed had to raise interest rates very far, very fast. And so the long-term securities that Silicon Valley Bank held, their value dropped very dramatically. And it was that difference between their book value and their market value that led to the huge lack of reserves that the bank had, and which ultimately led to their failure. So if a more market-oriented approach could have been used to manage and drive, or to organically manage and drive interest rates, I think we would have seen much less volatility in those interest rates, and they wouldn't have been held low for so long, and they wouldn't have had to be raised so rapidly. And if there are any young economists in the audience who are listening, our next generation of economists here, one really important, worthwhile, big challenge that you could take on is, how can we gradually move to economies where market forces drive interest rates rather than a relatively small number of so-called experts? We know that whenever a small number of decision makers are making decisions, they're bound to make mistakes. The mistakes won't cancel each other out, as will be the case if there are hundreds or thousands or millions of decision makers, as there would be in a market-driven economy and decision-making process. So how can we evolve to that kind of market environment that we had before 1913 in the US, before the Fed was created? How could we get back to that? That would be a challenge and opportunity for any of you of our next generation. I haven't even mentioned the moral hazard that the Fed created by insuring all of the deposits in Silicon Valley Bank. The FDIC, it seems to me, not unreasonably, or at least much more reasonably, insures just up to $250,000, which I understand covers 98% of the US population. To bail out the millionaires and billionaires who held much more in the way of assets just invites cronyism, it seems to me, and also encourages future banks to be similarly cavalier. So those are a few thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I wholeheartedly agree with all of the things that you've said, and I'd just like to put some color on it. Certainly, I was working at Chemical Bank, as John mentioned, responsible for the overall interest rate risk, and you can't really look at interest rate risk of any bank without looking at the liquidity mismatches as well. And it's a real challenge. I mean, it takes a lot of thought and it takes a lot of analysis to sort of judge, for example, what percentage of your demand deposits, or current accounts as they're called here in Europe, are going to stick around in a crisis situation. I mean, you'll ask 5 experts and you get 5 different answers. So I'd just like to highlight to you that, or to all of you, that this part of banking is at least as much art than science, which is different than credit management, or there too, your ability to identify who is creditworthy or not. So I'm sure they've made a lot of mistakes at the bank, but nobody is really in crisis mode when they're planning their mismatches, their liquidity or interest rate risk mismatches. But related to this, there is a real challenge from the regulator's point of view, and you made a very good point. And we had this debate when I was at Chemical Bank all the time. And it was the time when actually the regulators were changing the rules as to which securities have to be marked to market in a bank. And for exactly the reasons that you've stated, for those securities where they're there to hedge or to be there in the longer term, the argument is clear that you shouldn't be marking those to market. Well, I think current regulation actually forces you to do so, and it exactly exacerbates the problem. It forces the problems that they eventually see. So I just wanted to show that from a banking perspective, it's really, really difficult to manage, and the regulators are not helping.
If I could add, Peter, to what you just said, but there's a tremendous inconsistency with the regulators, because on one hand, talking about the mark-to-market, there is also the held-to-maturity portfolio, as they call it, which the rule is you do not mark-to-market. But the problem is, if you are holding 2% US Treasury paper, and you don't have those deposits anymore that you pay 0 on, and you have to go borrow at 4%, you're going to be suffering minus 2% loss or carry for the life of that portfolio. And so there's an inconsistency there. There's also an inconsistency that I'd like you to think about. To what extent did the Fed, who was saying inflation is transitory, encourage these banks and others holding this long paper, or perhaps to buy more for yield? Because if you were sitting there and thinking, oh, these rates are not going to go up, I'll believe the Fed because inflation is coming down, you would have done what Silicon Valley Bank did.
So let's imagine that, that what is the downside to the Fed in this particular instance? I remember this cartoon when it came out and found it fantastic, but I wanted to roll the window down in the ambulance because I think you'd see Jamie Dimon, the chairman of JP Morgan Bank, laughing and waving, and the briefcase would say small and regional banks. You know, as an employer, as an operator of a number of businesses, and the real estate investments that I make, Jamie Dimon's not meeting with me in New York. I'm talking to those small and regional banks. Even the much sexier John Chisholm in Silicon Valley is going to Silicon Valley Bank. And the reason you went there is because they were more friendly to the kind of work that you were doing. And these big government likes big banks. Big government likes big business. And I don't think that the Fed saw any downside whatsoever for what they were doing because it wasn't going to harm their friends, if you'll pardon the expression. It would only harm the people that they care less about. And the rest of us in the Midwest or where we happen to be looking at going from that company of 50 people to 100 to 300 can't get banked. We can't be financed. So we have to go to private markets or some other direction, which is a much more expensive alternative, in order to accomplish the same thing because we don't have access to those capital markets that are provided by the guy in the ambulance, not the guy on the road.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, first, I want to make the point that each inflation is transitory. That was a really funny statement the Fed made, and by the way, the ECB as well. It matters whether the inflation will last for 2 months, for 6 months, for 5 years, for 10 years, and whether it will go into 10% or up to 10%, up to 50%, up to 1,000%. Don't you agree? I mean, that matters. Okay, when it comes to Silicon Valley Bank, the first thing I thought when I heard that they are going bankrupt was go woke, go broke. They were also heavily invested, as far as I know, in some crypto empires that then crumbled. So I think the FTX outfall had a lot to do with the downfall of the Silicon Valley Bank. That's not saying that I think that crypto is dangerous per se. I just think that this bank acted to a degree irresponsibly and therefore shouldn't, or it was good that it was not rescued. John, by the way, I agree with you that it is a huge mistake to guarantee the deposits of the deposit holders, because that clearly creates a huge moral hazard. So, and when it comes, last point, when it comes to also what John said regarding what young economists should focus on, I agree on that, but I also think there are already structures in place that could be used for that. For example, think about what happens in decentralized finance currently. This is exactly going into the point you made. So, yeah.
I think you're talking more about Signature Bank as far as the crypto is concerned, because my understanding is that Silicon Valley Bank was not in the same kind of thing. John, people talked about Silicon Valley Bank as sort of an exceptional case because of its hybrid nature servicing the venture capital and tech industry. And the reason why I'm asking about this is because there is concern, and the big question is, particularly when you see what First Republic's numbers came out today of its deposit loss, are we beyond the crisis as far as the regional banks are concerned, or are we still waiting for more shoes to drop? I'm not sure Silicon Valley Bank, being a hybrid with extensive payroll servicing for tech startups and so forth, can be equated the same with the First Republics and other regional banks that are more heavily commercial real estate loaded up and have a different kind of deposit base.
I would just be speculating as to how the feds in Washington perceive Silicon Valley Bank as being similar or different from other banks, regional, mid-sized. I liked very much the point which Terry made about, our friends in Washington are the large banks that we can control, and relatively few of them, so we can keep tabs on them. If there are lots of banks, medium-sized banks, it's harder to ask them to comply with regulations, so I could see how Silicon Valley Bank was in that mid-tier range, but particularly visible by virtue of its central role in Silicon Valley. And so had it been a different bank that wasn't so visible, would they have been fully bailed out? I don't know. Maybe not, it seems to me. It would be interesting to hear from some of our other banking experts on that question.
Your point, Terry's sort of pointing out in you an interesting shift, because in the old days in the United States, particularly with the House of Representatives, the community bankers had sway. So what has happened to those guys? I mean,
that was actually the point I was going to make, was one of the devastating unintended consequences, or perhaps intended consequences, of the Dodd-Frank and the major regulatory changes that were made in the wake of the 2008-2009 financial crisis, was the imposition on community banks on who they could lend to, how they could lend to, what kinds of collateral had to be present. And at the time, the community banks were the heart and soul of looking somebody in the eye and saying, yes, I will happily make this loan because I know you. You have been in part of this family, et cetera. And all of a sudden, you broke that line of communication. And those farmers, those small businesses, those others had nowhere else to go, and that dramatically changed socioeconomically an entire class of business, and that has only continued. And one of the anecdotes I know of the Friday after the Silicon Valley collapse was there were a lot of mid-sized banks in that second tier, that sort of 10 to 20 size, that had a lot of phone calls from technology IPO types who said, I do not have enough money to pay my people on Monday. And those banks said, great, I'll go ahead and lend you whatever, but in return, your collateral is your company. And you had a shift of a lot of that second tier banks who are now moving up into that top tier. Now, competition and things happen, and creative destruction is a natural process, but not when it's somewhat an architectural issue. And again, it's the continuation of that community bank problem. And now we've got the community banks not able to react again. And that has a devastating consequence on the heartland and other important parts of the United States.
I would go to a more, in addition to that, a sociological reason. You look at the history of the American president campaign cycle. Every single one of those individuals claimed to be from a rural area. They wrapped themselves in agriculture and apple pie and all these things, except and up to Barack Obama, who claimed to be from an urban area and was actually from a rural area, unlike Nixon and others who were from urban areas and claimed to be from rural areas. There's been a shift along the way. And now you see this notion, and I think this plagues my friends and others who work for the Federal Reserve Bank or in other places. They can't imagine themselves in some rural backwater of less than 3 million people where there are only 2 restaurants that have Michelin stars. The amount of wealth that's been generated in this world has created this sort of aristocracy in financial markets that I think is concerning. I remember many years ago, we were looking to capitalize or recapitalize a company into growth. And the person was saying, well, you need to ask for a lot more money because our cost of even reviewing the loan is enormous. And he went through what this was, and I'm like, how is that even possible? And the reason is because the number of people who are flying in, where they stay, how they live while they're there. There's a need to consume some of this wealth on the part of these folks that has a negative effect on people who are living in that, I need $18 million to expand my factory. And it's difficult to find those kind of bankers who can interface in any real way with the larger apparatus federally from these 9 or maybe 10 US cities that have become their own sort of form of kingdom.
Okay. If we are moving from the banks to other naked swimmers, this is the time to do that. This is for later, but I didn't want to keep the ambulance and the dead guy on the slideshow for too long. But we'll get back to this is quantitative easing slide. But we can get into that actually. I have a lot of respect for a hedge fund manager named David Einhorn, who runs Greenlight Capital. And he came up with an interpretation of quantitative easing, of which we've had, depending upon how you define it, 6 by the Federal Reserve, 20-something by the Bank of Japan, and the ECB I can never figure out, so I leave that to the Europeans here. And he calls it the jelly donut theory, that the first jelly donut that you eat tastes pretty good. The second jelly donut is a bit of an indulgence. By the 10th jelly donut, you are sick. And we have the analogy to quantitative easing and to the extent interest rates. And what he said at the end was, you know, the fact that you stop eating those jelly donuts actually makes your body stronger and healthier. So the question is, with interest rates back to, quote, perhaps normal, the economy, the world, the way we operate, the way we do our businesses, the way small business gets financed, how the economy can grow, is better off at these higher rates than at the rates that we've been living with for 13 years until last year. What's your thoughts about?
Certainly for the consumer, it's much better, isn't it? I mean, now they can invest their savings and get a normal interest rate on it. The problem with the past number of years is that we've had negative real interest rates. And so for the average person, you've been losing money. And so you've been always forced to sort of try to find something that's riskier that will compensate for that loss of the interest rate that you can get in either a bank deposit or in a treasury.
It's a good point you raised. At the same time, I'm not that optimistic for the simple reason that neither the ECB nor the Fed will keep up high interest rates for long. We will have an economic crash in conjunction with the banking crash quite soon, in my opinion. We are seeing the first signs of this everywhere. And at that time, when that happens, I think it won't even be a month that the ECB will say, unfortunately, our inflation goal we won't be able to pursue our inflation goal for longer. We will have to readapt because of the crisis symptoms we are seeing now. And it's to a degree understandable because it all sounds good that you can save your money in the bank, but if people don't have employment, it's kind of difficult to save something. So, yeah, it will be a trade-off that the central banks will have to make. The good news is they maybe will be able to kick the can down the road a little bit further, maybe for a few years. The bad news is the issue that we have bought time, we have bought time for the last 10 years minimum. And now the end game is pretty much here, and we will have to deal with that some way or the other.
But Terry's, and you are saying that the political forces are not going to allow that they're going to keep kicking the can in the road.
Yeah, I would say, by the way, I think it's 4 jelly donuts is about when you get sick. I don't think I could make it to 10, but depends on how big they are and how much powdered sugar is on top. There are 2 falsehoods about politics and economics that are seen by the general public as being truths. And one is the political sense that I have to do something. That is a standard challenge we have among elected officials, especially among banking regulators for whom many see the economy as a series of computer dials to be turned and twisted when the market is decidedly not that. And the second problem among sort of the general population is the sense that there is such a thing as free money. And while those are untruths, they are seen as factual statements. And that is why we continue to kick things down, because there is such a thing as free money and the government needs to do something. And that is a dangerous combination.
You're saying politicians are viewing it as free money?
Politicians view it as free money and their constituents view it as free money. It's a dangerous combination. There are very few politicians who actually understand economics. And there are no congressional staff who do it all.
But there's also something called common sense and this wonderful phrase that I love, no free lunch.
Same basic concept. The idea of trade-offs is not something that's understood, or opportunity costs are not understood by the general population and many in Congress. I have worked with many a congressional office that thinks, oh no, we'll just add to this and print this and do more, and that's fine, because that's why they were elected, was to bring that back, and they lack any kind of an economic understanding. Just as an anecdote, take us back to 2008, and one of the biggest, here we have a major financial collapse, and you have Congress and a president stuck in the we have to do something. And I remember at the time working at GMU, working at the Mercatus Center, working among sort of free market economic groups, and we had, that people forget that the very first attempt to pass what became the financial bailout actually failed. It failed bipartisanly. And part of the reason it failed was the inability, or perhaps the ability, of an average politician to look at the price tag and just say, I can't get my head around the number of commas in this. And we had phone calls, the Cato Institute, the Heritage Foundation, sort of the conservative free market think tank community, which was equally caught off guard, of members of Congress saying, help me understand how I'm supposed to say no, because I know in my gut that this does not seem right. No one really had a good response. 4 days later, they did another bill, and it passed because there was this sort of sense of, well, we have to do something and we don't understand. That's a lot of behind the scenes of how the Dodd-Frank and the financial bailout were actually passed in Congress, which is sort of scary and sad at the same time.
I don't know what's going to happen to interest rates, but I hope they do stay at the range of 4 to 5% or perhaps higher for an extended period of time. We forget that interest on a savings account is a way for everyone in the economy, no matter how modest their resources, to participate and, over the long term, prosper. Think of the 1950s and 60s in the US. Inflation was a lot lower, but the savings account was the way that people eventually acquired the means to put a down payment on a house or pay for a child's education. It may well be that by keeping interest rates artificially low for so long, as we did for much of the last decade or two, that we actually increased inequality in the US because people who had very modest resources, who couldn't afford to take the risk of playing the stock market, only got a negligible or negative return on their savings. Whereas people who had more in the way of resources could more confidently take the risk of playing the stock market, and then they enjoyed higher returns. So it seems to me it's a return to a healthier state. It's also, this may be wishful thinking, but maybe it would also incentivize our leaders to constrain spending, public spending, because maybe it'll just make them realize how huge the cost of debt becomes with higher interest rates. That would be a good thing.
I think the spending issue is a critical one, which we'll go into later, but it's not just public, there's private. I mean, if you look at these, what are they called, HELOC loans, home equity line of credit, that were used during this period of low interest rates because they're floating rate interest, people were using their homes as ATM machines. The question I have is, America has always promoted, and certainly the government has said, consumption is the driver in the United States for the economy. Do you think that that could change? I mean, COVID stopped it dead on its tracks, and then it just sort of released like an explosion, which is part of the inflationary impact we're still seeing. But has that consumption mentality changed at all in the US?
Two things. One, I'm not sure that always exists in the US. In fact, I think there was an extended period in the United States where it was more about really trying to prove that this experiment might work. You know, there are many who believe that America was founded in 1776. I think it was probably more like 1840 or so before there was any degree of stability in the country. And then you go beyond that, resolving some of the early issues with how slavery would be dissolved, which was an inevitability, certainly. And then the role of America in the world. These were things that were priorities far above this idea of materialism. It's only during this sort of Pax Americana, if you want to call it that you've seen this expansion of consumerism that I believe was driven as much by political figures as it was by anyone else. And I referred to that earlier. So now, is it American consumers who are addicted to this notion of spending and feeling good, or is it American politicians who have identified this as a way to ensure their reelection? You know, in 1800, elected officials in the United States did it as a part-time job where they were taken away from their real jobs. You know, John and I and others around this room have real jobs. We're doing this as volunteers to try to be helpful to this discourse. This is not what we do professionally. My staff and others are often highly annoyed by the fact that, who is this John Chisholm guy and why are you spending time with him all over the world? Right, it's very dubious. But American politicians and politicians around the world now have identified this as a very lucrative way to spend your time. During the pandemic, most U.S. government employees surpassed their counterparts in the private sector on average wages. Now, I'll use an example that I think indicates this, is we're being instructed because of new green or green, old green, or moldy green, or whatever we're calling it, to spend more for less. So we're still spending, but now we've got to replace everything that we already have but with something that's far more expensive than what we purchased already, with something new that's better somehow, and eliminate the thing that we had before. It strikes me that this drunken spending spree is only accelerating, not decelerating.
Yeah, just anecdotally, observation, when one flies in Europe and flies on a European carrier, after the food cart has come by and drink or a snack has been offered, there's often the duty-free shop, right, that comes down and would you like something, et cetera. That never happens in the United States. But on every American Airlines, Delta Airlines, and United Airlines flight, when you're about 10 minutes from landing, the flight attendant gets up and offers the credit card that you can get right then and there to sign up for with 60,000 points and no interest for a year, and walks down the line with their little brochures. And there is always at least one or two people on board who reach for that credit card. It's been that way for a long time.
So the public sector, if we go back to what John is talking about in terms of public sector spending, we have, and I don't know where it stands in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, we have the CHIPS Act, and we have an infrastructure bill. I don't think that's passed yet. These are all highly stimulative. Where are they still in the works, or and something for us to worry about in terms of its inflationary impact, or is it already done in?
I think the bigger issue in Washington relative to spending is that Congress has yet to actually go through the process of approving a federal budget. It tends to be a punting every 6 months of a continuation bill, and Congress has never actually debated the entire federal budget department by department in something like 15 years. So the process right now is not even a responsible process to be able to have a vote on the larger spending issue, let alone what they see as a Band-Aid approach to addressing the particular issue at hand of inflation or whatnot. So the institutional challenge within Congress is they're not even dealing with the process internally to address federal spending across the board.
Back to these naked swimmers that we're trying to anticipate or look for. We've had large corporations ignoring CapEx and instead taking advantage of the low rates to do stock buybacks. There are more and more prominent people coming out to say we should ban stock buybacks. How much damage have we done to the infrastructure in that corporate America should have done through CapEx that has been severely decreased over the last 5 to 7 years? And what does it say in terms of this whole concept of bringing back onshoring our manufacturing? Is this going to be happening? Is this inevitable? Is this being encouraged? Where do you see that going?
The stock buyback phenomena is a very, very interesting one because money came into many of these corporations as found money. You won the lottery. It's remarkable. A company that was failing going into the pandemic was only forestalled from its failure. If the business principles were not sound, if their operating management team was not in place and they could not succeed, the pandemic allowed them a window of opportunity to maybe sort out their house before the ship sank. On the other hand, companies that were operating efficiently and effectively before the pandemic were able to capitalize on those opportunities and came out with a stockpile of cash that they're only beginning to think about what to do with. I don't think it's irrational to imagine that if you literally won the lottery in a company that you would go to your shareholders and say, we'll take you out. If you're ready to go, here's a pile of cash. I think about the companies that I've invested in over the years. There have been many that I would have been delighted for somebody to come to me and say, you've been around for 8 years longer than you expected. We had a windfall. We're going to buy you out. Because traditionally we've produced 2% return. You were getting none of that. Now we've got enough cash to provide you a decent rate of return all in from the beginning of your investment to now. I think it's a very expected, even normal reaction by the marketplace to what's happened. The fact that any educated member of the Federal Reserve Bank would deny that they expected this is going to happen, I mean, you're a banker, but I think they were taking a snooze if they really didn't notice. And it's much more likely that they knew this was going to happen and they were okay with it.
I mean, if we go to one not talked about area for the naked swimmers are the pension funds. And if we're talking about, and I like to put it in the context of the 60-40 funds, because for the first time, I think since inception of the 60-40 concept of fund, they lost money, and significant money. What does that imply from your perspective?
Well, it implies that California and Illinois are in far worse shape than most people realize, because those are the two states with probably the highest unfunded pension liability issues. California's been going on a long time. From a political standpoint, it comes down to the issue of government unions versus the elected official, which is what's driving the Illinois issues in particular. And the legislature, which has a very short-term focus, is often sold a bill of goods that, oh, this is going to be fine, but it's the same problem of this next generation's problem. It's not mine. Now, there have been some successful efforts in Illinois to sort of shore up some of the pension liability, but the numbers are staggering. But to the average union worker, which in California is the dominant part of the sector, it affects some cities worse than others as well. San Diego in particular has had issues. But there are 2 or 3 states where, by all rational standards, they should not be having a conversation about punting on. The money is going to run out. This is even a more contentious issue than Social Security, which as a national issue is one that my generation and others are we have no expectation of getting a penny when we turn a certain age. And it's been that way since I was 5 years old, and that was 52 years ago. So the pension issue in California, Illinois, a little bit Louisiana, it's better in Ohio, is starting to drive the political conversation. And there are some in the government unions for whom it's most effective that are looking at the bottom line dollars and starting to put a little more pressure on their state legislators to actually make some changes. But we all look at those states, and Indiana, I think, actually has a fairly conservative way of looking at, and come from a constitutional standpoint of protecting it. And that's the states that have put into the Constitution that the liability must not be there are actually doing very well. But there are many states that simply ignore the bottom line, and it's devastating to California in particular.
Whether there are changes to the budget, which implies whether they increase, real estate taxes or state and city taxes, but there's also the refinancing question, because if later on when we talk about the federal deficit and the debt ceiling, and looking at markets even today, if you look at treasury bills in the 1 month versus the 3 month, it's pricing in some high risk of a treasury default. So putting that aside for the moment, how on earth, if we're worried about the federal level, how on earth can we expect some of these cities, states, at the local level to find buyers for their paper? What's going to happen if, where are the buyers now? I mean, I believe it's these triple tax exempt funds, but there's got to be a limitation there. Where is the money going to come from to refinance these states that are excessively in debt?
I don't know about everyone in the audience or up here, but when I don't sell enough goods, I lower my costs. I stop spending as much money. And that is not on the table. We have an ant and a grasshopper problem, which is leading to enormous strain in the American political system. You have states like Indiana, which has a fully funded collection of pensions. But on the other hand, they've spent less money on social programs, perhaps on education. If you're number one on having your pensions fully funded, that makes it more difficult to be number one in having the best bridge infrastructure in America. And you look at other states that are 38th on their pensions, but number 3 in pre-kindergarten spending. Those are decisions that were made by those leaders. In the event of a collapse, there will be political favoritism. That you see these cities, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, places that are very deeply invested in a particular political perspective, who will demand a revenue sharing or a conduit for loss spreading, even said a better way, that will take money from the treasury of the states that have been responsible. So they will have benefited both from higher spending on the things that they desired and no downside risk for the things that they suddenly can't afford. I remember watching the city of Detroit go bankrupt, and not a single painting was sold out of the art museum. I think there should have been a yard sale, at least to consider, if they hope to spend other things, that there are luxuries that you give up when you overspent. And the lesson right now to government municipalities is be a grasshopper, not an ant. The ants are hardworking, they've collected the grain, but boy, they're dull. Look how interesting and beautiful we are. We fly in and we take what we want, and then we go to the next place once we've depleted that storehouse.
But you do have people leaving California for Texas or Florida. So if that trend continues, the income sources for California, to take an example, or Illinois, will shrink. And if they don't cut, then it's going to, if I understand what you're saying, you either get, depending on the political party involved, we'll either see what we saw in the New York Post when I was a teenager, which was president says drop dead New York, and as a result they had the Big Apple, Big Mac bonds, or we're going to see, as you described, the favoritism and bailing out with federal funds.
I've lived in San Francisco now for 13 years, and it's recently becoming a ghost town downtown. I like to say that San Francisco has beautiful hardware and defective software. The hardware are the ocean, the bay, the bridges, the hills. The software is our city governance.
But are you seeing a change in terms of the voting at the local level? Is there hope, or what's your view of where?
Well, of course, we removed our district attorney last year, who was not doing his job at all. He had a long history as a public defender, and he was still wearing the hat of a public defender as district attorney. And we also removed 3 members of the school board who were more focused on such things as changing the names of schools rather than education. Apart from those very visible things, I don't know. It's
and there weren't changes based on, well, they're spending too much money, right? There were changes based on what school subjects were being taught, or in the case of the DA, the crime rate. They weren't focused on spending, were they?
It may well be that the people who care the most or are concerned the most are leaving, and that the ones who don't care as much, I don't want to say that. I think people who have stayed do care, but they see things differently, obviously, than the people who have left. I've got to believe that at some point, the reason I'm still there in San Francisco is because I believe at some point it will get so bad that there will be a regime change. I don't know how close or far that is away, but I think back to New York in the 1980s, where Mayor Giuliani came in and was real tough on crime, and I'm hopeful that we'll have a regime change along those lines. Incidentally, lots of high-tech companies are laying off people right now. That overconsumption that we saw during the pandemic is disappearing, and there have been, as a result, a lot of crunch downs of valuations of startups. And I think what's the most important thing an entrepreneur can learn or should learn right now in Silicon Valley, and for that matter, a small business person anywhere. And I think it is to save something for a rainy day. I just coined that expression, pass it around, maybe it'll catch on. But there are 2 benefits to saving something for a rainy day. Number 1, of course, it makes it easier to get through the hard times if you have some funds in reserve. And number 2, other assets become significantly discounted. And if you are one of the few people who has saved something for a rainy day, you might be the one who's able to acquire those assets at a very discounted price and thereby enrich your business or your life, depending upon the type of the asset. In fact, you might even be able to acquire one of your competitors. And so destinies can really be made during economic downturns like right now.
Yeah.
Just as a short-term example and something to watch, to sort of build on your idea of that political instability or economic instability can lead to political regime change, is the city of Chicago. Chicago is different from San Francisco and New York in that it's got sort of a Midwestern value vibe. It is generally, historically, racially, and ethnically more diverse than San Francisco and New York. It has an institutional corruption that is almost celebrated. Right. It's no secret. This is the Chicago way. This goes back to Al Capone, among other things. So there's no secret to this. But it was experiencing in the early 2000s a sort of return to the city of young people, young professionals. And part of that is because there are a significant number of universities in Cook County that draw a lot of folks in. It is not nearly as expensive as either coasts. It becomes the drawing place for Minnesotans and Iowans and even North Dakotans coming down. So again, a different vibe. And it has suffered immensely of the crime problems that have San Francisco now does and New York. It has just had a major electoral change. And the gentleman elected as mayor was elected literally with 97% support of the Chicago Public School Union. That's where his money came from. That's where the numbers came from. There was nothing hidden about this. This was an all or nothing move by the Chicago public school system, which is also becoming one of the worst in the country. But here we have a situation where, just like California, Illinois and Chicagoans have left to go to Florida, have left to go to Tennessee. So there is no longer that tax base to draw in. The ethnic minorities, in some cases majority, are as frustrated with the violence as the North Side white folks. And you have a mayor where he is not going to have the income to continue to kowtow to the public union, and Chicago in the next 4 years may drop 1 or 2 points in. You're going to, I think, see an increase. And if Chicago has this turnaround, there's actually hope for Chicago, for both coasts. But I think we need to watch Chicago in the next 3 years to see how this all plays out, because it's waiting to happen.
So you're more hopeful on the coasts and less hopeful in...
I think I'm actually more hopeful in Chicago because I think we're going to see more quickly, well, I'm optimistic we're going to see more quickly this combination of instability and economic instability and political will. How it plays out is going to affect both coasts, but it's going to happen more quickly in the Midwest before either coast.
But in terms of, the money has to come from somewhere, and it's either the debt's going to get defaulted on or not serviced. If it gets defaulted on, the city can't raise any money, period, for a decade. So how can they service the debt and still have the conflict
without
between
raising
running
taxes on everybody?
but as you said, the tax base drops. In other words, is a deterioration that are we going to see it at the state level first, and is it those states that you...
Yeah, I do think it's certain states, and I think one of the first steps you're going to see is actually a change in the regulatory scheme. One of the things we haven't really talked about is in the macroeconomic world, interest rates and monetary policy matters, but the real driver of change in a negative way or positive way is the increase in the regulatory state, certainly at the federal level and increasingly at the state level. And increasing regulatory burden, just like taxes on corporations is passed on, compliance costs are passed on. And I think the first place you see change is actually a reduction to the entrepreneurial opportunity to make it easier and encourage the entrepreneur to come in and take the risk without being hit with the regulatory compliance, and a reduction in actual social services, which will be that's the real political will, because if you can actually reduce the cost of some of the social services in the area, you have that ability politically, whether you have the will to, but that's how you can start to reduce the budgets that you were talking about earlier. If that happens, that will be a positive change, and you may see capital naturally fly to places like Chicago as opposed to New York. But you're right, there's still a tax-based problem.
Yeah, I understand Illinois has had exit tax for people who leave. Is that right?
Illinois is going after people who now live in Florida
So the question, who's going to be bearing the burden? Is it small businesses, which is a lot easier to burden than large companies with political lobby?
Well, of course it is. This is the nationalization of businesses that happened in Europe and continues to happen over and again. There are, 3 ways that you can resolve this kind of crisis. The first is through patience and pain. How do you lose 100 pounds? You stop eating. You can't exercise enough, especially when you get to be old like I am, to lose that kind of weight. You just have to eat less. The second is war. You generate some externality that will lead to some patriotic spending or taking of money from other people. This leads to populism and this kind of anger movement that we're seeing around the world. And the third is communism or socialism that looks like it, which is we're going to redistribute all this wealth for some period of time. It's going to make everything feel okay. Now, in the long term, of course, that just really kills it all. But the way to make San Francisco feel good is to take all the money from the people that are living at the top of the building and equalize it to the people living at the bottom of the building. And that works as it did in Venezuela, as it did in France, as it does everywhere for a while. And then the whole dang thing collapses because the only people that benefit in that circumstance is who? The government officials who are on top of that pile and benefit. The difficulty is we, as a population, have to wake up or at least pay attention or admit that we got a little fat and the only way to lose it is through some pain and discipline. Restraint, which is I think what John was talking about.
The word we are looking for is austerity, but I haven't heard that word mentioned in a long time. I think in the second session, because we're going to be breaking in 10 minutes, the second session we need to look at technology as a driver, because from what I'm reading, there are 2 sides of the coin. There's the hope for the future that comes through technology, whether it's AI, fusion, which will make energy basically zero cost, and that will be the driver to get us out of this debt burden, et cetera, or equally the technology behind universal basic income, central bank digital currencies, control via a la China. Those are both sides of the technology coin, and I think in the second session, if we could discuss that. But just to wrap up on this, sort of going back to what you were saying, Terry, on, basically crony capitalism. And if you could talk a little bit about regulatory capture. I imagine it happens in Europe as well, but certainly my knowledge and experience is in the US, where I've had classmates in the government going into industry, not so much the other way around, but unless you're very high, like a Goldman Sachs partner. Could you address where that stands with respect to the financial industry, the military-industrial complex, pharma, technology? What do we need to watch out for with respect to crony capitalism? And maybe Lawson, you could kick that off.
Cronyism is so misunderstood. And I do like to say cronyism, not crony capitalism, but it is cronyism. And this is another great example of how Washingtonians, and I mean by that by the staff and the agencies, do not understand the relationship. So you alluded earlier to the Capital Campus programs that I ran a long time ago, and this was an attempt to sort of teach basic economic principles. One of the things we did was take the bootleggers and Baptist theory of regulation, which is Bruce Yandel's ability of sort of why do the Baptists, meaning sort of the moral thinkers, and the bootleggers, meaning the ones who are actually making a product, both very much support blue closing laws on Sundays not to sell alcohol. And you think, well, but because they both benefit, they both get what they get, they're actually in cahoots for the same thing because they're actually reducing competition, which is bad, but benefits each of them equally. We would go to congressional staffers and say, why is it that the Philip Morris and the Ban Smoking National Association are together coming to you to say, this is a really good bill that you're about to do? When you see those two entities coming into your room, your first reaction should not be, oh, look, bipartisanship, happiness, joy, this is a good thing. This is how we should be working. No, you should be cynically saying, why are they together? It's because Philip Morris just wiped out all of their competition by working with tobacco-free kids to get something passed that only they can comply with. This is a grossly misunderstood idea, and it is a nonpartisan issue. It's probably the one issue where center-right and center-left can actually agree that this insidiousness of regulatory agencies working with the actual groups. And the problem what's happening now is because the growth of regulation is so significant, companies, rather than say, you need to reduce the regulatory burden, are saying, no, I need to carve out too. And he needs a carve out. And now everybody has a carve out, but it's left in place the regulatory burden, which has decimated the ability of the entrepreneur to actually come in and take a risk. I mean, this is how the system is right now, and it's devastating to macroeconomic and microeconomic ideas.
Yeah, regulations create barriers to entry, and who gets barriered? It's the small company, the startup that can't afford to comply with the regulation. Why are there so few software entrepreneurs in Europe? Might GDPR have something to do with it? The cost of complying with the data protection regulation and other regulations. Why are there relatively few pharmaceutical companies in the US? Because the regulatory hurdles are so high. It now costs billions of dollars to field test a new drug. That's way out of the range of most startups in biotech. So their only exit opportunity is to be acquired by one of the established pharmaceutical companies. So all of this makes the industry less vibrant, more brittle, easier to control, and ultimately makes the world more of a zero-sum world. Because if there's a huge expanse of space, opportunity space, in which people can start businesses, they can address different segments of that space without bumping into each other. But if there's a really tightly controlled, think of a high-dimensional space that's bounded by regulations on every side so that all the startups are confined to a tiny little space, they necessarily start to compete with each other. If there are 100,000 or more startups in health and fitness mobile apps, but yet relatively few in aviation, pharmaceuticals, building construction. Why? Because these areas, in part, why? Because they are more heavily regulated. If just a few of those entrepreneurs in that health and fitness mobile apps could be freed up to work in all of the other domains, many more of them would be successful, and the world and humanity would be much better off, and innovation would progress much more rapidly.
And if we don't do it in the US, then the Chinese and the Indians will.
Yeah.
Martin, last
just-
word before we take a break.
Just one statement on that. John, perfectly agree. The thing is, if governments regulate, they always have the current state of the economy in mind, never the potentiality. And that's important. That's really important to keep in mind. Also, to reiterate John's point, where does real innovation take place nowadays? It's mostly in the cryptocurrency space. It's in the spaces where there's not so much regulation. Also, to a degree, in shadow economy structures. So we have to keep in mind that if the government regulates the normal economy, people will flee to other structures to innovate. That's completely natural. So yeah, we have to keep that in mind.
Got 5 minutes for questions. We'll have a chance to do more questions after the show. Nevin.
I'm going to be real brief. One of the things that I didn't mention in my lecture, which is basically what you three mentioned, right? You said, Terry, that politicians have to do something, right? So that's like a statement one. And then you, Martin, said that the cheap money has allowed for money to be redistributed to politicians. So you basically have what they wanted, they got through this. But then John mentioned something I haven't heard in 25 years from my first semester in college, price discovery. So what's going on now? Now the interest rates are up, you're having a price discovery. Someone has to pay for it. And in case someone didn't get my sarcasm about Viktor Orban, why is that so important? Why am I talking so much about politics? Because I'm a bond trader. And you have a Fidesz party winning, and you have a Croatian headline saying that Hungary and Viktor Orban are a threat to European democracy. Then a week later, you have a Croatian prime minister saying that his political goal is to be elected for the third time, and the headline is he's a visionary of political stability. So you have exactly the two same things being interpreted in completely two ways, which is what my predecessor mentioned. Now, why is that so important for the bond market? Someone has to buy your debt. And this is the question you talked about. And this is the question Terry mentioned about the cities. Someone has to buy that debt. And deficits are going up. And it's irrelevant. The percentage of GDP is irrelevant. How many billions more do you need? And sooner or later, someone's going to say, well, considering all this political instability, I'm not going to buy your debt. And in that second, you have what you mentioned, the only equilibrium out is basically central bank buying, and then you have the only one way out, which is really high inflation, which will devastate the economy. So I think the three things you mentioned, when you put them together, you basically get an exceptionally dangerous cocktail that will be first in the market, then in politics, and then the breakdown will come in the market. And this is the risk that I think about all the time whenever I'm putting a bond trade, or if I want to buy and hold a bond for fixed income. And that's why the political stability becomes so important, but it cannot be political stability through hypocrisy. It has to be political stability through democracy. And it cannot be a bond market through infinite purchases by the central bank. It has to be a bond market through price discovery, through supply and demand.
Great, thank you.
We tend to believe, it's a great thing about humans is that we forget anything that came before us. I'm not even sure I remember exactly what happened yesterday, but I'm trying to hang on. It's not like the first time that this has ever happened. You were mentioning the state of Indiana. The reason that Indiana is in the position that it's in with its pension funds is not because they're virtuous or we're virtuous citizens by any stretch of the imagination. An entrepreneurial government decided to build a canal. So the canal was 400 miles or so. They were 8 miles in and had spent 80% of the money. So the happy politicians went to Washington, D.C. with their cup in hand and said, somebody has to buy this. And Washington said, no, we don't. No one has to buy it. No one has to buy it. Fail. Good luck. God bless you. We're taking care of the East Coast. That's what we really care about. And so the political leadership at the time had to find a private sector solution. They went to bankers and others and said, will you help us out of this disaster by refinancing our own debt over a long-term payment plan? In the same way that I can't pay my 5-year mortgage because I'm upside down on my debt, but I could pay a 50-year mortgage. But I don't want to have to sit there and, eat the meal that I prepared for myself over the next 50 years. And so in that game, they required a constitutional amendment. The private bankers and individuals said, we'll invest in this, but you have to agree to restraint on your spending. Over a period of years, that benefit was realized. And by the way, John, you did this on purpose, I think, just to fire me up. You dropped an A-bomb, the austerity word. I've got to tell you that my dear wife occasionally tells me that my pants are not shrinking at the dry cleaners, but that I need to slow down a little bit. And when she comes to me and says, you're about to go on a starvation diet, you're going to be uncomfortable, it's going to be terrible, but it's going to be good for you. It doesn't work very effectively. So over the years, what she's learned to do is to say, we're going to eat healthy. We're going to do this together. You're going to feel better. It's going to be better for you. And so I wonder, what was the intention of politicians who put their constituencies on an austerity diet? I don't believe for 1 second they intended for that to be successful. So you go back and you read the rhetoric on this, which I've done in Indiana, and there was a particular political switch that led Indiana to believe that it was going to be better, and that they had made mistakes and that they needed to be better. Granted, it was a Quaker sort of a culture, and this self-flagellation of Protestants maybe played into it, but at the same time, those political leaders did not exonerate the citizens from the decisions that they've made. They instead offered a positive vision of what fiscal restraint and good decision-making would mean. I think that that's something that is seriously lacking in Europe and is becoming increasingly lacking in the United States. There are still pockets here and there, but in these large cities in America, I'm deeply concerned about the rhetoric and the way that they wrap these things.
Keep in mind for next session after our half-hour break, the small continuation of who's going to buy the bonds. The real question will be the reserve currency role of the dollar, deglobalization, de-dollarization, because that's who's been buying the U.S. Treasury bonds. Thank you very much for taking a half-hour break.